was saying, Chebec is a project financed by Interreg program and intends to support the cultural and creative sector access to markets while keeping the identity of the participants. In the last 2.5 years, Chebec has been supporting around 85 professionals and companies from all Chebec regions, which are 10, in order to develop their international competencies and contacts. This support was given by an integrated program that contains training, consultancy, and mobility actions. This is the last of 3 webinars, and we, the partners, decided to approach the current situation brought by COVID-19 and its effects and opportunities for the cultural sector. Being this a time of reinventions, we thought that Charles Landry is the right person to guide us on this webinar. Charles Landry is an international authority on the use of imagination in urban change. He invented the concept of creative city in the late 80s. Its focus is on how cities can create and enable conditions for people to think, to plan, and to act with imagination to solve problems and develop opportunities. The notion has become a global movement and changed the way cities think about their own capabilities and resources by reinventing themselves. The current situation due to COVID-19 poses massive changes to all of us, including the ones who work under the cultural and creative sector. Does this sector has a special role to perform in helping to create a positive outcome of the crisis? Do we need to move to new ways of making and producing culture? Does the digital alternative provides a democratic and human-centered access to culture? These and other questions will be in the background of this webinar. I ask you please to keep your micros off. During and after Charles' presentation, if you have questions, please write in the chat box of Zoom. Then my colleague Philip Duarte will gather those questions and moderate the debate with Charles Landry. Okay, thank you. Welcome again to all of you. Let's start.
Well, I hope you can see that. Can you all see that? Can you all see my slides here? Anyway, I wish I was seeing you in person, but I can't see you in person, so I hope we can have some collective hug later, a virtual one or something else like that. I suppose my main feeling is that the hubris has been humbled. You know, the hubris is the arrogance, the thinking you can do anything, and the virus has told us perhaps it's not that easy. But in a way, crisis is so often a time for culture. And I suppose everybody is now looking at where we go and how we can get there and trying to absorb the manifestations of what has been happening over the last 4 months. So if we think about the future, I mean, I think we're all thinking about that. It's obviously not very clear. And a friend of mine who's a visual artist, but also a public artist, he did this, and instead of saying lockdown, he put this near where I live in a town. It looks a bit scruffy, luckdown rather than lockdown. So artists are still working, obviously, in one way or another. But when you're in the eye of a storm, it's often so difficult to reflect clearly. And the question, I think, for all of us is how, when there are so many things in front of us which just create barriers to thinking forward and endangers our projects, that is obviously incredibly difficult. And I think the virus has created a situation which is a bit like shattering glass, and it's sort of zoomed through the glass and left just these fragments behind it, And one of the issues is whether, with this corona, we can recreate a mosaic that makes sense for the cultural world. But I think one of the main conclusions that everybody's reached is, of course, the fragility of everything. Things fall apart. The foundations on which we built things are completely unstable. And the question, I think, though, nevertheless, is how can we look at something and say there may or may not be, or may ideally be, some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. But I think one of the problems is that when one has anxiety or angst and things like that, it's so difficult to really dare to think ahead, to think through a shape of what this future place, this place for art, this place for culture could be, and what it could look like. And I saw an exhibition last year, and I just found these photos, and it was called Constructing the World, Reconstructing the World. And it says there, and this artist, this shows classically the role of artists, the world we constructed is a monster. Then another one of these objects says the crisis is a trick to control us. Many believe that. Another says the crisis is there to split us up and to divide us. And there it says the new reality. And I thought the last little tent I saw, the emergency will replace the contemporary. So we're living obviously in an emergency. I mean, that's just an artistic expression which seems to be looking forward to the situation we're in, even though I saw it 18 months ago. And the lesson, I think, the big lesson in words is our civilization is a thin film of order we build around the chaos of events. And what for me is interesting is the extent to which those in the cultural world can make that thin film of order a sort of better order, a more stable order of some sort. And the big message, and I think everybody will have their own messages, but I was just thinking about what my messages are to you, is there's clarity and confusion. I feel at the one hand incredibly clear, and on the other hand, very confused. And I think the interesting point here is this is quite logical when one's trying to reflect in the eye of a storm. But I think one of the key conclusions that is absolutely clear is that we are all social beings. I think we all have our experience of not being able to do that physical touching and all of those things I do not need to elaborate on. And what is also clear, and I'm telling you what you know, so I don't need to elaborate again, is of course the power of arts and culture, its capacity to connect and so on. A second big message for me is really the classic arguments that we all know, you know them all, are actually have a new urgency. And I'm just only going to focus on the instrumental arguments. Obviously, people as artists are not always thinking about what is my social impact, what is my impact on the economy, what is my impact on tourism. Of course, that's not the only thing. But nevertheless, I think when there are all these other crises surrounding us beyond the cultural one, it's useful to remind oneself again of the instrumental effects, which is not to deny that within art there is something that is well beyond an instrumental effect. And these words you all know: connection, cohesion, well-being, health, bonding and understanding, the whole sensory system. And unless we understand the sensory system, we don't know who we are, we don't know where we are, how the world operates. Every sense, of course, is part of the special topic that arts and culture addresses in a way that perhaps no other mode of thinking and acting does. And that all leads to the experience that we have in life. This is a shorthand way of saying we only understand life really if we understand the expressions through art and culture. So what that leads me is then to my final little segment, and my final message here is what I found so interesting is that this moment has focused on what really matters. Each of us will have their version of that, but that's the point of clarity I was talking about. And I found a quote by an Italian doctor, brilliant. He said, "I want to remember and keep the memory of this moment if it ever gets better, because in that moment and in the memory of that moment, I knew what was really important." And I think that is perhaps one of the silver linings. That memory of that moment can be used in a constructive way. And the memory and the clarity of that moment, I believe, can drive energy in the sense that one's more committed not to let things go back to an older normal that was not very good. Because that older normal we know about was a 1 minute before midnight situation, climate change, etc., etc. And the interesting point is that we all know that our economic order is materially expansive, socially divisive, and environmentally hostile. I don't need to remind you of that. But we didn't feel that urgency that we feel now, because if we walk out, you younger people will probably be absolutely fine. The older people of us might just walk out, catch the virus and die. So there's a slight difference in who might be affected here. But I think what we know, you remember that phrase by Clinton who said, "It's the economy, it's the economy, it's the economy is the problem." Well, it's the paradigm that's the problem, stupid. And I think we all know that. So then I always ask myself, what is our role? What is your role as people who are involved in artistic and cultural activities? And what I think can be interesting is that one form of art is not going to decline and is not suffering. And I saw this recently in Belgium, and it said, "Capitalism is chaos, anarchy is order." I just thought this was quite interesting. Okay, we may believe this or not, but that art form, graffiti, I think, has not got a problem at the moment. But there's a bigger thing around this issue of art and culture, is that the transformation that is inevitably going to happen is in itself a cultural project, because it's about what we think is important, what our values are. That becomes our choices. Ideally, that becomes the politics. But of course, just as a reminder, the importance, and I'm just using this graph, of what we understood arts and culture to be in every dimension, whether it's economic, whether it's in terms of its generalized impacts in very other differing ways, has of course gone up. I don't need to give you the statistics of the loss of employment, the way things have gone down, confidence has gone down, particularly in this sector. There's lots of evidence already building up and statistics. And so we don't need to elaborate on that. But the crisis we're talking about is manifold. There's obviously the health crisis. Hopefully there will be a way of containing it in 1 year, 2 years, we don't know. There is, of course, the economic crisis that might be 5 years. It might be 10 years. It's certainly more than a few months. And then there's the crisis of having people like this person around who is effectively very dangerous. So that's a crisis. Let's call that a political crisis. And then there's the crisis that is too little spoken of, which is the psychological crisis. Because everybody who was conscious, more than a few years old, who lived through this, who's living through this moment, will remember it probably forever. And that is a psychological moment. Now, it may push us into ourselves. It may mean we don't trust people anymore. All of these things you know of. And so, of course, also there is the cultural crisis, which perhaps, as this Resiliart project talks about, turn itself back and gain confidence. And this is the question I want to address in a moment, how one can regain confidence for this sector. But clearly the big lesson we all know as well was the breakthrough, which is in essentially the digital pivot. Many of those things were already happening. Of course, we're now all in this world. We're now having a conference, obviously, of some sort. And that has enabled various things, but it's not the same as being face-to-face, obviously. But what the post-virus or the virus thing has done, it's been the biggest inadvertent expense reduction. I mean, you've seen the maps of before and after, you can hear the birds sing, all of these things, the sky is a bit bluer and all of that. But the other thing that it's done, and I've done quite a bit of work in the last 3 months around various cultural institutions, is it's really forced all of them to rethink who they are and what their role is. It's obviously accelerated the digital turn that was already happening, as you know, and it's shifting how we work and socialize. But it's also created a sense of grief and loss of that urban life. And we have a sense of what urban life is. Just, I mean, rural life can also be quite interesting, or life in smaller places. But all the things that we often say are good about that, chance encounter, density, buzz, all of these things are the opposite of what this moment is bringing. Now, will it continue forever? We will see. But that creates, again, another psychological moment, which is this grief and loss moment. But we stand really before a stark choice here, which way to go. And I'm just thinking, there's those that think the old normal that what they wanted, they see that old normal, which needed to change, as an exotic destination. So for many, this old normal is a real exotic, beautiful place they want to come back to. And the dilemma's there is that we will forget the older urgencies, one of which was moving towards public transport, doing various things that are positive about the environment. But those suddenly become dilemmas. If you feel uncomfortable in public transport, you will then go back to the haven of your car. I'm only using this as one example, which is the opposite of what we want. And being in your car and feeling relatively safe will feel like traveling to, I don't know, Timbuktu or some exotic destination. So these dilemmas, which are being covered up, are going to re-emerge. So is there a sort of different way? Is there a plan B that we can think about? So if you think about post and pandemic places, one thing to remind oneself is that pandemics all through history have shaped the city. In fact, the cholera pandemic, which was solved through sewage systems in the 19th century, created a whole set of things that led to around how cities work, including health and safety in the sense of things like how many people can be in a space and so on. Clearly, this health and safety issue will come up again with new forms of regulations about how many people can be in space and so on. And even if the pandemic is over, the regulations will probably still be there, even though we might feel it's okay for them not to be there anymore. The gathering together, clearly external spaces, it's fine. But if it's winter and I'm in Finland, do I want to listen to a concert? Well, perhaps it's fine. I'll just get used to it. As they say in Nordic countries, there is never any cold. It's only the clothes you're wearing. So perhaps, but anyway, there will obviously be more an emphasis on the public realm, and the more Mediterranean companies can benefit from that. The moving around issue, I think the predictions are really that micro-mobility will dramatically rise, and all of that will also help this gathering, because you can then gather with your micro-mobility things in spaces perhaps not too close to each other. But I personally believe that because the young are less affected by the virus, they will lead the return to a type of city we know, if we're looking at it in general, as distinct from the venues that of course will have problems because there'll be rules and regulations around that because of the memory of the pandemic if it goes. What is already happening is, as people have found they're working from home, this is changing the relationship to the office, and there will be far less offices in cities, big and small. And what I think that will lead to is a repopulation of cities quite dramatically. Even though I believe many of the shops we love, the distinctive shops, will fail because they will go out of business. And it's the Amazons and the big companies that are actually going to be transforming. So that's a negative thing that's happening. But I think the positive thing is that I think the young will revitalize places, students and others and so on, as all these offices become places as dwellings. But it will also make smaller places more attractive. If you're in, let's say, near Portugal, Lisbon, you might say Caldas da Rainha is more attractive than it ever was before. And that feeds into something a lot of people are saying, is that performance will focus much more locally for various reasons. Now, of course, if a drug suddenly exists that can deal with all of this and there's a vaccine or so, then there would be a return in a crazy way. When Louis Vuitton opened in Wuhan, it suddenly on the first day sold $2 million of bags, I gather. But anyway, I'm saying this is all still there. So we know what these places look like now. They're obviously empty in various ways. And the question is, will the city look like this? This is far too corporate. Or will it be like this? This is Station F, as you probably know, in Paris. And perhaps they already knew that we will have these self-isolating cubicles. But this is an interesting design question, because the way design will work and urban design will work will be affected by everything I'm saying. But what also is a negative effect that I think will happen is the notion of ghettos. That's the picture of the first ghetto in Venice. You probably recognize it. That was the first ghetto in 400 or 500 years ago. And there will be more gated estates where you will only be able to go in, which will be a version of the small bubbles we've got of 10 people, 20. There'll be estates of, let's say, 300 people, which will be a collective bubble where you will be tested perhaps before you go in to that environment. But I think there'll be an interesting thing to consider is how the young will respond to these shifts in time and things that are happening versus the old. But of course, the very big central, or one of the very big central issues is, of course, how do you reassemble the argument? And I basically think, certainly the work I was doing in Germany recently, was that Germany gives a lot of money for art and culture, as you know. But when you've got a vast economic crisis, when there are now going to be more homeless people, when there's going to be all of these problems, people at some point are going to ask, well, why am I, for example, in the German context, spending so much money on museums, on projects, on theatres and so on? And that's why I believe one has to reassemble the argument for culture. It already exists, but on the fourth pillar principles, which you know, the fourth pillar of sustainability is culture, on an equal level to economics, the social and the environmental. Now, I know that may sound to you a bit traditional, but I feel that that is probably one of the most effective ways forward. And within that reassemblage, based on this thing that it is the central point, it's got all these things about cohesion. Not, of course, art just being art, but art can also obviously have community, etc. impacts. it's really then to build the argument around not allowing people to force you into a position where you say, what is the value of culture? But that your argument is based is, what is the cost of you not valuing art and culture? And that shift, I think, is the one I just want to highlight here. Now, obviously, we've seen images like this of people playing on balconies and all of that. This happens to be from Italy, etc. But when that conversation starts, it really, from within the cultural sector, needs to be a collective conversation, not about sectors arguing against others. And this is really where I think some sort of unity within the cultural fabric needs to be created as sort of one voice, rather than this sector should get more than that sector, and so on. I think because otherwise there could very well be the divide and rule situation. So in waking up to that potential fourth pillar of sustainability idea, I think if expressed well and the language is used well and the artistic programming behind it reflects it well, I think that can be powerful. But we've got another and that I want to then mention, which is an obvious one. I think we're obviously going to have more blended experiences. I mean, to some extent, we're having a blended experience now. And that blended experience is also then about blended audiences. So I can imagine in many contexts, we've got a live audience, which might be sitting quite separately, at least for the moment, but we've then got that virtual audience as well at the same time. And I think what all of this brings together is these culturally great, interesting, creative places in building their argument will really say, what we can do is be these things I'm saying. We are the place, we are the activities that create anchorage. We are the activities that create possibilities. We create connection. We create learning. We create inspiration. And I'm not saying you use exactly these words, but it's these words within them, if then spelt out properly, have, I think, potential power. So if we now go to the cultural forms and their worlds, which is my final section, if we look at each of them, they all have a different set of obvious, you know, what's the situation in the visual arts? How are they responding? The performing arts, obviously the most difficult. Design, including the web, film, TV, the digital, museums and heritage. Let's just go through two of these worlds, or three, just to sort of open out the conversation. So the visual arts world, or writing, the making of visual arts is mostly going to be okay. Even Ai Weiwei, you know, will probably be able to build something with his team, or you know, anyone else. But so mostly that would probably be okay. Distributing the work of art, getting it somewhere through the roads in books and all of that will broadly still perhaps be okay. Being in galleries might be a different experience. It's probably okay, not as exciting as before. Selling actually is surprisingly the art market. I've been looking at the art market for some other thing, is actually, especially if the artist is known, you don't really need to be in a fair. If you're buying Hans Alber's painting, you don't need to look at it because you know what it looks like. The problem is for the young and up-and-coming artists that cannot really do that necessary social networking. And clearly the social networking is a problem that we all know, and obviously social distancing reduces that. And so the experiencing of that visual arts is not really okay, because although you can go into the picture and do all these fantastic things, there isn't the buzz of just seeing someone next to you. So if you're just writing a book, I'm writing a report at the moment, that's fine. I don't need to see anyone. I can be alone. My friend, again, who put dyslexia up, he can do that relatively easily. There will be less people in this Anish Kapoor sculpture in Chicago, but it will still be there. I think this is where Damien Hirst produces a lot of his stuff near where I live, that will still be okay, I think. But it's really that looking at the art, although many of the new virtual experience of looking at art in a very slow way with a camera can actually be better than in a gallery, it's still not the same as walking through the gallery and the museum at the same time, which in a sense can often be seen as a unity. So, as I said earlier, art fairs can still work, and this happens to be one in Los Angeles. There are just fewer people around. Here we come to the big problem area, and so many of you work in the performing arts. You might be able to make it if you've got 6 people. That could be okay. Getting it out there, my God, I'm just thinking of, you know, a major pop concert and all the logistics and all of that. Not easy. I think the seeing is going to be very difficult in those gatherings we talked about, unless there's some sort of drug. And the selling, I think, is so-so. I mean, the selling through digital means, as you all know. So there's nothing I can add to that. But this seems to me the biggest area where we collectively need to think imaginatively what one can do. Clearly, this is the Liceu in that singing that Nasun Dorma in Barcelona. Clearly, one can do things like that, but this is not going to be satisfactory through time. And it was interesting, Simon McBurney, who runs Theatre Complicité, who's very well known. I don't know how well known he is in all of your countries, but he's very famous here. He said what you perhaps also think, the crisis is an opportunity to reshape culture. It's possible to rethink. But then we spoke the other day, he says, but I've got absolutely fucking no idea how. And I think actually that humility is quite good, even though he actually did know how. If any of you have seen The Encounter, which uses earphones in ways, is one of the best theatrical digital experiences that you can have. So funnily enough, he did know this. So any of you just look up The Encounter if you don't know about it, and how that, created by Simon, who hates the digital, actually created a work of art 4 years ago, and it's now being performed. It was online in the UK, and 180,000 people looked at it online. So it could increase audiences. This is the local centre where I am. I presume there would be less of those people around there. That's my daughter in the circus being held up. That was, of course, cancelled, her show. We think that it will never have the same buzz for the next few years unless there is a vaccine. But of course, there are two sides, because we all know as performers, it's the audience that you need. And it's not only the audience, like in this famous Time image, looking at a 3D film, it's the audience and the performance together that creates it. If I physically had you next to me, you would see me moving my arms around. You might hate it. You might think, why don't you bloody stop moving your arms around? But that's just the way I am. And I would then be looking at some of you, but I can't do any of that. So there's something obviously missing through the live. So you might have performances where everybody's separate like this. I don't know. Whether you have that, I doubt it for a while. Whether you have that, I think at some festival quite soon, people will do that, especially if they feel confident that they haven't got a problem. But I thought was quite interesting. Did you see the German Football League, one of the first matches? This is 15,000 fake people who each bought a seat, and there's a cardboard printout of their face, who are watching this football match. And there are no visitors, just 15,000 of them. Now, I think there's going to be some very interesting versions of this. So I think in the intermediary period, concerts or theatres will have one empty seat where there might be a digital person and then a real person next to it. I don't know. I believe there will be creativity in thinking that through. I don't think it will substitute for the experiences we've had, but nevertheless, it could be interesting. I'll just say a few words of the obvious. Obviously there's been the digital pivot. Digital media, of course, and gaming and all of that stuff is actually having massive opportunities. So the making, disseminating, seeing, selling, discussing, and all of that is, if they were egotistical, you could say they're having a great moment. And I think to some extent that also is true of design, because so much design is really web driven and so on. So I think what's going to happen in the end, and whether that's good, and that will be up for us for our choices, is really these different versions: the extended reality, the mixed reality, the augmented reality, and the virtual reality, all of which are sort of quite similar but slightly different. And I think that's one of the templates of our future experience. However, I do think that in public space gathering will have a new central use. So all of this stuff with film and so on might be difficult to produce. I don't know to what extent it will really suffer, but I certainly think the digital will benefit. This is just me inside Arts Electronica in Linz, inside one of these digital experiences. So I think all of these types of things, this is typically Korean, but all stuff like Team Lab in Tokyo, those sort of digital experiences, I think will still be created, and it's just that the people walking through them will be less than before. And so my final point is that if we take all of this into account, my first point is, in terms of my final message, is that one needs to reassemble that argument to show the urgency of culture. I know that sounds incredibly boring, but whilst it sounds boring, it's the thing that might maintain the funding, might get some special fund of funds for culture, etc., etc. And the second point is that we really need to look at the rules and regulation system. There needs to be some real creativity. And I think the cultural community itself can come up with some creative ideas, perhaps, around how new regulations and incentives can be created. This is actually a Russian piece of artwork, not surprisingly, where they're saying the old rules don't work. And that links to some of you. I mean, I know Tita, who's in the audience from Bandung, who know me, knows that one of my latest obsession is about a creative bureaucracy. How does a bureaucracy function in this new age? And this is even more urgent than before. And we've got a festival coming up, a digital festival at the end of September. So if I get your emails, we'll invite you all to that. But my main point is really the rules and regulations. We need some innovation in that. And I'm calling us a we, need to be part of that. And I think we especially need to influence the new young creative bureaucrats that might emerge. So that's my presentation. And thank you very much for listening.
So Charles, I don't know if everybody understood. If you want to ask any questions, you can ask them in the chat box. I do have some questions that our partners prepared for you.
Oh yeah, great.
Okay, so about the first topic, that is cultural and resilient places. Yeah, I have a question that says, creativity and artistic practices have always been among the main ingredients of culture-led urban regeneration. Cultural spaces generally come from bottom-up processes that exploit human capital rather than monetary resources. How do you think this crisis will affect this aspect?
What was the last word? I understood it about cultural spaces. What was the very last sentence you said?
I said cultural spaces generally come from bottom-up processes that exploit human capital rather than monetary resources.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you think this crisis will affect this aspect?
Right. I like all crises, like all new technology, like all of these things, there's always two sides. My own sense is I mean, firstly, the classic cultural space that might have been an old building that we like, and we like it because it's got some aspect of the history in it and that you're making, shaping, and all of those spaces. In many, many cities all across Europe, definitely, and also other places around the world, they've already been done up in some sense. And because we all know the lessons that artistic practice basically regenerates places, and artists are often the vanguard of gentrification, whether they like it or not, they create the buzz that creates the prices to rise. We know that that's happened. I think that the financial crisis will be so big, and there will be people looking for so many answers, and simple, let's make a top profit is not going to work. So people are going to want some ideas. I mean, those institutions that can survive the current crisis that already exist is one thing. I think this could be the moment precisely for the more bottom-up thing, because you know that English expression we shouldn't use, the shit hits the fan. It's so bad, I think, that I think this is our moment to some extent. Now, you might think I'm naive. At one level, I have to be naive, because if I'm not naive, I'm not sort of positive enough. And because I'm always trying to look at the glass half full, the whole idea of the creative city is about what's the opportunity rather than only focusing on the problem. But I think, as always, the bottom up is being challenged. As always, the bottom up has to fight hard. However, I think in general, people realize now with this moment, you're going to have to listen to the bottom up a bit more. You know, we're listening to nurses and care workers more than we did before. Let's hope we don't forget all that. So I'm hoping it'll be more okay than not okay. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's an answer.
But there's also two more lines in this question. But the other question is, do you think that they will manage, I mean, the cultural spaces, to keep carrying out their initiatives, which are pivotal in creating cohesive communities? Do you think?
That's why, you know, I'm always a bit embarrassed to talk about these bigger arguments, you know, advocacy arguments, but because I've been making the bloody arguments for 35, 40 years, I mean, I'm so bored with making the arguments actually myself. I think one has to make the argument, because how are you going to persuade someone who doesn't get it? So clearly the projects are going to be more difficult, but the community projects or the social projects this person is perhaps referring to are going to be so urgent that they're going to say, help me, is what my hope is. Because, you know, the psychological damage, you know, and economic damage that's being done is so intense. It's not only a question. Obviously, people want a job. I mean, one of the main things is they want jobs to be able to survive and so on. But there's much more going on than that, and all the people who won't get jobs, you know, who might be 54 and have lost a job, and, you know, there are 150 32-year-olds who want that job. Of course, you're going to give it to the 32-year-old.
Okay, so going to another question that our partners prepared. It says, reads like this: nowadays, the public discourse on CCIs is particularly focused on the interaction of culture with other sectors, especially health and education, since arts can bring added value to yet untapped fields. However, we are all aware of the facts that creative organizations have always contributed to these aspects. Many theatre companies constantly work with the local community and schools, cultural associations bring arts to hospitals, etc., etc. What should be done to make these initiatives an integral part of our system? Do you think that this crisis will accelerate these processes?
I think we're still going to have the same problem as we had before. Of course, it's a bit like one aspect of my answer is the one I gave before. I still think we're going to have, of course, theatres have been doing this for years. And of course, if you ask people what was the most transformative moment you had in your school life, often it's being part of a theatre programme, for example, or singing in a choir or playing in a band or something like that. We know that. I personally, if I can just go around this question, and I have to blame myself because I always used to talk about cultural planning. We have to get cultural planning into city making and so on. And I think we were not as effective as we should be. And partly because people thought cultural planning means planning a physical building or planning something that costs a lot of money. Whereas I think we should have said planning culturally, which is very different in English, at least. Cultural planning, you think of a building and you think of all that stuff. But if I say planning culturally, it implies that you understand what culture is about and you then understand the impact of it. So part of this reframing the argument should be perhaps using more of that of those words. Now, in relation to the theatres and all of that, it may well be, because we also know that theatres, when they're doing this work, we're just using theatres as an example, are actually relatively cheap, all things considered. And it's back to these, again, I'm calling them boring, but incredibly important arguments about providing the evidence. And unfortunately, I think we're back to this moment of needing to reassemble the evidence, because I think all of the questions that are being asked are saying, can we survive this moment? Basically, of course, I'm saying it's very difficult. But I think I would add this point about providing the evidence to it, the evidence of the cost effectiveness of it, or basically turning these questions round. Like when I said the value of, I never discuss anymore what's the value of art or culture. I always say what's the cost of not. Is finding a way of, with decision makers, having a conversation which is not putting you onto the back foot, you as the person who's asking, let's say a theatre company, but you having to justify to a theatre company why not, when quite clearly they're providing effectively services that would cost much more in another way. Easy to say. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say this, by the way. Give me another difficult question.
Another difficult question.
I'll ask some of these people in this room, like Patricia or Sergio or Elena or Belma or Anna. I'll ask them a question.
I have a question here from Anaïs. It's in the chat, but I also have a question from Alice de Matos that sent it just to me. So I would like to read this one because it was before, and then I will pass to the other one. Alice asks us, I would like to know, thinking in the context of Global South, how to instigate more public policies that focus on cultural artistic practice for the youth at risk. And then she adds, I do believe in the potential of using art to transform social reality. If the world, especially in the Global South, it's coming out of the crisis economically poor and with increasing inequality, how can the society and governments push those practices as means to opportunity?
I mean, none of these questions are easy. I mean, look, what that question reminds me of is the fact that this world that is represented in this meeting here with us here all together can't operate on its own. It's part of this bigger world with these other people, some of whom agree with us and some of whom disagree with us. And so that's back to me saying that this transformation project, which we need to, whether we like it or not, things are transforming. We need to see that transformation project as a cultural project in the bigger sense and the narrower sense. It's a cultural project because it's about values. So the person who asked that question is talking about inequality and all of those things. basically artists or this community needs to be more politically active is really partly the answer, because it's not going to, there's no god from the sky or goddess from the sky going to answer that question, which is effectively about the economic system and the way we run economics and the environment and everything else. So all I can say to that question is I agree. All I can say is there are great projects doing that. They have done it for 50 years. They need funding. They can only do it if they have funding. They can only get funding if they are seen to be the center stage, at the center stage on the table of decision making, which then leads me back to reassembling this argument that you are at the center stage. And I keep on coming back to that point, is what happens when we forget that? And if we can provide the evidence of what happens when you forget that, i.e. the places suffer in many ways, you know, beyond the economics and all of that, they're suffering in many ways. That's all I can say. I mean, you know, I bet there are lots of projects in this group of listeners here that are fantastic and are not getting wide enough audiences because people aren't enabling them to do so. I'm just looking at, I love the name Artie Farty. I don't know what Hyacinth from Artie Farty is like, but I'm sure with a name like Artie Farty, he's got some very interesting projects that could be more than they are expressed now. I'm back always to how do you put culture center stage in the decision-making rooms, which means we need to also be more sophisticated in how we make our arguments effectively, is what I'm saying.
Okay, so I'm gonna keep the order, otherwise it will be chaos. And well, Anaisa, my colleague, asks, under the need of connect culture with other sectors areas, can you elaborate more on the arguments to defend these links and their importance, mainly in this time of distancing, of social distancing?
Under the need to connect culture with other sectors, can you elaborate more on the arguments to defend these? I mean, the link between, in the current context, loneliness, youth loneliness, yeah, and cultural activity quite clearly is one way of addressing that. I mean, that's not rocket science. So anything to do with health, mental health, loneliness, and all of that. Again, we're just basically. You may think I'm extremely boring because I keep on coming back to similar points, because for me it's so self-understood that these things are important that I find it quite difficult to answer some of the questions. And so in the relation to Anaisa's question, it's again getting those people who are not in the room, who should be in the room, which then throws a question back to the cultural sector. Either am I in the room where I should be, where the decision making, and if not, why am I not in the room? Is that because I'm not clever enough or not sophisticated enough, or what? I'm convinced that somehow everybody here can be more in the decision making room than they are. And it might mean in some cases that people have to reassess how they make the argument. They might need to learn more, or they need to think of their connection with these other sectors. Anaisa, you know, all of these questions are not being sufficiently answered. I know that, but anyway, off we go. I'll answer the next question. Give me the next one, Felipe. This
okay,
like
I have two that I think
punishment.
I think I have two that I think that are basically refer to the same problem. That is, one is about only what about urban arts, and the other one is how to create in public space in this context of isolation.
How do you create public space in this context? How do you create in public space? Can the role of the create? How to create in public space in the context of? I mean, I think if you define public space as the external space, I find that's less of a problem, because I think external public space is one of the few places that's going to be relatively more open than the other places. I mean, I think our problem is more in the enclosed spaces, which is why I think the whole notion of design is going to change. So the way I'm thinking about it, and I'm sure many of you have as well, is you've got your very interior spaces where you've got a bit of problem, but if we get a vaccine, this might all change, of social distancing. Then I think there are going to be these, in an events venue, you would call it lobby spaces, but these permeable intermediary spaces, I think are going to become ever more important. And I think that in these intermediary and external spaces, producing, I don't see so much of a problem, depending on how many people are producing and what they're producing. What I'm most concerned about is having the audience. How do we get the audience in? How do I, as a creator who wants to communicate with an audience, get that immediate feedback that I think the artist type person gets inspired by that audience? And that is really the real dilemma. And that does link to density. You know, if I've got 7 people floating around a room, it's a different experience than if I've got 50. So I'm less worried about the public space, if we mean public being more external.
Yes, I think the problem is a bit also the question of confidence, of the psychological impact of this crisis, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of trust we've already addressed. I mean, clearly we have to rebuild trust. Now, supposing I saw Anaïs and you, Felipe, would I touch you?
Yeah.
You know, it's a question of trust. Would I hold your hand?
Yeah.
I just don't know. Now, should
you even kiss them?
Would I kiss them? Yeah, I know, it's a question. It is a question. I mean, look, if I'm in Taiwan, I've worked a lot in Taiwan, I would kiss anyone. You know, so I think the rebuilding trust thing, I think the problem really is I keep on saying the same words, we are in the eye of the storm, we don't know. Get a vaccine. SARS was 18 years ago, there is no vaccine.
Yeah.
We may get another pandemic because we're destroying, you know, the pandemics, you've read all about it, like all of us, you know, destroying the earth, digging up the earth, mixing animals in ways you shouldn't, is going to create more pandemics. But let's just hope for the moment this particular one we can solve, in which case solve or make relatively more safe. It's a question of statistics and risk, isn't it? If we say, because you're in Portugal, Felipe and Anaïs, if we say, I'm just using Lisbon, I know you're not in Lisbon, but if you're in Lisbon, let's say, you know, there's been only 2 cases in the last 4 weeks, then you probably won't mind having the trust to be close to someone.
Yeah. Yes. Well, another question that is, wait a second, from our partner Sveva. If Mr. Landry would be the policymaker, how he would use public funds now to face the emergency that CCR are facing. So do you have any policy recommendations?
Well, there is that policy guy, you know, what's his name? I've forgotten, the Polish guy who's from the EU who has all these policy recommendations. He operates, I'm sure you've heard him, I've forgotten his name, Martin Hoffman or something. Anyway, he's probably better than me. If I was a policymaker, how would I face emergencies? You see, I would put more money in CCI than in road, the sort of thing I would do, but it's too radical. Basically, there's massive budgets, yeah, on things like infrastructure, yeah. If you just delay, I'm using a stupid example, making the road okay from Amsterdam to Brussels by 9 months, that probably gives you 40 million euros to the CCI. Now, I would try to reshift budgets because I would try to be making the argument that the impact of investing in the CCI is going to do more both for the economy and for mental health and for all these other things. So in the end, because there's no particularly money there, I would be shifting that. And what you might need to do is involve those departments in creating that CCI budget. I'm going to give you a stupid example. Utrecht, this is not about arts and culture. Utrecht built a circular road, circular economy road. The transport people were against it. Obviously, the environmental and economics people were for it. But they created it in such a way through such a process that the transport people thought they built the first circular economy road in the Netherlands. They think they invented the idea and made it. That's very positive. So I would do variations of that which is what I've been talking about all the time. How do you get the other person to believe they had the idea, which is a good idea? So in relation to this question here as a policymaker, there's no rocket science, because what we're always talking about is we're advocating. The CCI has been advocating within the EU for a long time. It's getting better. The New Horizon programs, which I was chairing one of the commissions, has got culture in it much more than any of the others before. And it's all this slow process. I think the process needs to be much faster, which is why I would try some radical suggestions like cut someone else's budget. And if they say no, involve them in creating a project that seems to be about both of them is probably a better approach.
Yes, that's always a problem, is to cut somebody else's budget, because
yeah, but it's inevitably, look, you've got less budget, you've got less than I want to have, so it's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah. I would go to these 3 questions from Raul that say, in which way the crisis can be linked with these 3 questions. 1, culture for use and non-for-profit speculation. 2, the property of cultural production resources by the workers. Well, it says 3, but there's only 2 points.
Well, I like that. That's a very creative way of asking 3 questions. The first one, yeah, I think the crisis is doing that. The crisis is so big. If we say, look, many of you are suffering financially, I appreciate that, and it's very easy for me to say whatever I'm saying. However, if we basically say, we are going to help you solve your problems. You've got a problem here of all these proportions that you know about, from mental health to loneliness to so-and-so and so-and-so. This is going to be really difficult. In the long term, this is going to cost you a hell of a lot of money. We have a solution to help the problem that you don't know how to solve. So I basically believe that's one of the big opportunities. So in answer to question 1, I'm really hopeful if this sector actually outlines, you know, in each city, and I don't know which cities you all come from, that you can actually help. Because obviously everybody's looking for answers. In relation to the second question, the property of the cultural production resources by the workers. That's very interesting English. It's so interesting that I don't understand it. So I simply don't understand what that means. So Raul, please.
Raul, do you want to?
Raul, on your iPad, huh? What do you mean?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What do you mean?
Well, okay, it's my Spanish translation, so excuse me for my...
Your English is better than my Spanish, so don't worry.
English, but what these 3 questions, the third one was, I will tell you later, but these 3 questions are not coming from me, are coming from Herbert Reed, You know him? It's an English.
Oh, Herbert Reed. Herbert Reed. Yeah, he died 50 years ago. Yeah, English author. Yes, Herbert Reed. Yeah.
From the 40s, that he was also a critic and cultural. Worker from this point of view, and really linked with the anarchist paradigm from the point of view of the way to work and the approach to the culture. Because from his point of view, he has some paper called "To Hell with Culture," or to evil with culture, something like that. That more or less the focus is how culture can be a driver for social transformation in a political way connected with the anarchist paradigm. I mean, against.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So the question is, right now, from my point of view, I'm economist, is that this crisis, what it's showing is that this is the emperor new clothes in some way. Have been assisting to this speech about culture as one of the drivers of growth and the Lisbon strategy, the Europe 2020.
Yeah, I get it.
Big mouth, no? This kind of big speech, but in a land that it's almost a desert from the point of view of the workers, maybe not from the point of view of the capital and the big money, but from the point of view of the big numbers of workers. They are working in precarity as the most.
No, I understand.
This is so. If the mediators and the big business and the capitalist part of the business is going for a. My impression is that this crisis is going to accelerate and to create some kind of conditions to go for more cake. Okay, for example, with the big platforms, with Netflix, Spotify, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that I understand. The logic of what's happening is obviously the big platforms are winning. Amazon is getting bigger, is getting more profits. All of those things. The small entities are closing and declining. That's why the political battle, this transformation, as I said, was a cultural project, because it's about values, and the values that you are implying, or Herbert Reed, or any of us in this room, is there should be a different value set, which is why I think this crisis, although it has given us a picture of some positive things, like in the environmental field, which is a good picture, it's giving us a bad potential picture of the other side. And there will be many people, like Amazon type people, who will be looking for the opportunities in a negative way, which is why I think we need to be more politically involved. I completely agree with you. So this is a political battle that we're in the midst of. I agree. That's the bigger story. There's an interesting question here. Something from Paula Garcia. Do you know that of the 1st of June, a place here in Portugal has 2,000 places sold in 11 minutes for a performance? Yeah, I mean, clearly you're right, it's dangerous, but at the same time, that shows you that this, in English we say pent up desire, this desire that's sort of in a prison, is wanting to burst out. So that's why I think in the long term, many of these problems about having performances, I feel more worried about internal performances where the city or someone can monitor how many people go in. But external performances, I think, will explode. And that's why I keep on saying, if it's the young who feel less worried from their health perspective, this is just an example of the evidence from my point of view, that question from Paula Garcia. I've got to leave actually in about 15 minutes. I don't know if I'm being...
Okay, am
I being impolite?
I'm just gonna, it's a final question also from our partners. I'm gonna post it actually, so I think it's easier for you to read it because it's a long. So everybody, so I just posted it.
By the way, even though you're asking me such difficult questions, I am enjoying this.
Okay, good. Well, I think everybody is enjoying. I mean,
well, we don't know. I don't know what Natalia Melu thinks, or
let's see in the end.
Or Stefano Mancini, or you know.
So I just posted it. You can read it. There is a quote, and it is quite used in the sustainability field. The quote is, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." Yeah, I agree. And then my colleague continues saying, "Still, many of the current initiatives that are addressing ecological and social sustainability issues are based on socio-technocratic solutions, which means addressing the effects, simple, complicated solutions, but not going to the root causes. To what extent can culture become a leverage point to abandon our current unsustainable paths and simple, complicated solutions and move towards a more systemic transformation towards sustainability and even further towards regeneration?"
Yeah, I mean, essentially, I'm reading that here now.
Yeah.
Effectively, we've been talking about that all through this session. That question, yeah. Which is when I keep on saying this transformation project is a cultural project, because it's about values, and it's about values is about choices, and if it's about choices, it's about politics. The question really here is much more the question, why, when so many groups and so many organizations from so many directions believe this sort of thing, is it not coming together? And the real challenge is how we get beyond the fragments. Because we haven't got that classic party system, left, right, all of these alignments have broken down. How can one bring these sources of difference together? I mean, we probably in this room agree with each other, but there's no mechanism by which we can show our strength and power. That's really the problem. And I think this requires partly our imagination. And perhaps what should happen at the end of this Chebec thing is precisely, sorry, I'm not saying you've got the resources to do it, but is to try and find a way of widening this conversation, which is transformation is a cultural project, which addresses the question that this person has just put down. Because we've heard all these things before. Obviously, I know it's about systemic. We all know those things. That's not to be negative about the question, but we know that to be true. The only question is, why is it not happening? And I think we need to, effectively, I'm saying we need to use our imagination to find ways of 1 + 1 equaling 10, or people like us finding a way to get to the sources of more power. It might just be locally initially, and then finding ways to connect as local entities and so on. That's a really difficult question. This is the sort of meaning of life question.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to. Anaisa, do you want to say something?
No,
I don't think there is any more questions.
I'm thinking lately that in my mind it pops the idea that we need to be a bit more radical somehow. I don't know yet what.
I'm hearing this.
Sorry?
Can you repeat that, please?
I'm thinking in my mind that maybe we need to become a bit more radical in our demands and.
In essence, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I completely agree, Anna.
I don't know how yet, but that's what I'm feeling.
Yeah, that's what I meant by, can we remember this moment, this moment of clarity that we felt, which is a combination of fear and clarity, which sort of gives you in a funny way a certain sort of energy, a sort of slightly frightening energy. Mm-hmm. If we can begin to use that whilst at the same time trying to be clear-headed. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? That one, in those contexts, sometimes finds it difficult to have a sharp mind. But I agree with you.
Well, in any case, our director had to leave. He apologizes, but I think we can end this one. Then you need to leave, Charles.
Should we have all the screens on and wave at each other or something?
Yeah.
Rafaela, put your bloody screen on. What about you? 2875485. Oh, there you are. You're a person. Okay.
We can connect the sound of all.
Okay, let's just do that. And I put all your screens on. I'm going to take a photo of you all. That's it. What about Sara Bonora? She's just S. Put your screen on. Oh, Bonora.
You can turn on the microphones now. It's not.
All right.
Out of interference. Well, thank you very much.
I hope that's
thank you to all.
Okay-ish.
Thank you.
Anyway, I enjoyed it. If you didn't enjoy it, I enjoyed it. So see you soon, everybody.
Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you so much.
Let me just get all your waves. Start waving and then I'll take a screenshot. Let me see. That's it. Great. Lots of love.
Thank you.
Kiss, kiss, kiss.
Thank you.
All of that.
Greetings.